We are in a season of anniversaries. Today's program celebrates the 40th anniversary of the construction of the Kauffman Museum Prairie reconstruction. In the early 1980s, tasked with creating a prairie to set the tone for visitors to the museum, Professor of Biology Dwight Platt set out collecting native seed, researching grass to forb ratios, visiting other prairie reconstructions, and establishing seedlings. He called for volunteers. Lorna Harder, a biology student at Bethel College studying under Dwight, answered that call and began to assist Dwight. Lorna's interest in the prairie led to her position as Curator of Natural History at Kauffman Museum. After 10 years at the museum, Lorna began teaching biology and environmental sciences at Hesston College, a career that lasted over 20 years. 40 years after working with Dwight, Lorna is still a strong prairie advocate. In retirement, Lorna offers her rich knowledge of prairie biology in other settings. In leadership roles at Dick Arboretum, as a guest curator for Kauffman Museum's recent A Day with the Birds exhibit, serving on the Creation Care Committee at Bethel College Mennonite Church, and recreating her own prairie plot with her husband Bob in what was once a pasture overgrown with cedars and other volunteer trees. Today, Lorna will tell us more about the early days and the method to the madness of creating the Kauffman Museum Prairie. Please help me welcome Lorna Harder as she presents Planting Prairie, Restoring Land and History.
So Andy, thank you so much, and thank you. It's a pleasure being here. This is honestly, this place, this prairie is where I got my start. This was it, right here. And it was the people that were here and the situation that was here that gave me my start. So it's really near and dear to my heart. So we'll get started. Where do I need to point for? Whoops, it works. Okay, I got it, I think. There we go. We'll get there. So, Andy gave you a little bit of an idea of the beginning of this prairie. I hope I can flesh it out. I'm going to give you an overview. I won't get into the weeds, no pun intended, because we don't get into the weeds here, we get into the prairie here. But that having been said, I'll give you a little bit of the details of this as well. In 1986, Dwight Platt, in Description of the Prairie Reconstruction Project, summarized as follows. The planning group early reached consensus that the development of the museum grounds should be integrated with the indoor exhibits and contribute to the storyline of the Kauffman Museum. These were some of the items that were outlined in this working outline, a document that comes from, well, you can see, I think 1983, 82, something like that. It was for that new Kauffman Museum, this building right here. A landscape plan was developed that reflects the relationship of the prairie as a natural system to the domestic human settings of the region. The visitor, on arrival at the museum, will see a prairie reconstruction of grasses and forbs native to south central Kansas. The prairie reconstruction and the indoor prairie exhibit will complement one another in interpreting the prairie ecosystem. The prairie reconstruction will be a living exhibit that portrays the dynamic nature of that ecosystem. And it will change with the seasons, with weather, and with changes in the life cycles of plants. It will provide an opportunity to interpret adaptations of the prairie with a living example. That was what the planners had in mind initially. So, how do you reconstruct a prairie? It's a bit of a tall order, if you think about it, to reconstruct some small part of a historic prairie ecosystem, for sure. These are just some of the questions that needed to be considered initially. A lot was unknown. So where would it be? How big? What plant species do you put in it? Where are you going to get those plants and the seeds? How do you go about planting it? And how do you go about managing it? And then finally, how do you go about telling people about this prairie reconstruction? That was those are the big questions that had to be answered to get this prairie reconstruction going. Well, we had a landscape master plan. This is the outdoors of the Prairie exhibit, and you can see here, let's see if I can get my, laser working. You said it was a little touchy. Okay. If you look on the bottom area there, you can see those round circles. Those were the prairie areas to be reconstructed, the areas to be reconstructed. That was the landscape plan. It comprised about an acre of the whole of the Kauffman Museum campus. There was a plan. And locating it and determining its size, the area outlined in red is how large the prairie reconstruction is at this point in time. It was planted in stages. I'll be talking more about that. But this is actually, it's expanded to about between 1 and 1.5 acres. So it's a little bit bigger than originally planned, but it is in keeping with the plan. Okay, we have location, we have size, and now we have to go to the plants. What are we going to plant here? If you think about this area, most of the prairies are gone from this area, and knowing what to plant, thinking about what was native to this area was not immediately obvious. The Bethel College, I don't know how many of you are aware of this, the Bethel College has a collection of historical plant specimens dating back. These were collected in Harvey, McPherson, and Marion counties by Evert, and they were collected in 1893, 1895, and 1896. It's a treasure trove, actually, of what was here. And so I photographed just one of these for you. This is purple prairie clover. This is the cover of that specimen. It was collected in a pasture 5 miles north of Hillsborough on June 11th, 1896 by Evert. And there you see that specimen still in good condition. Okay, so the herbarium collection, I think there are, I want to say about 100 specimens that were part of our understanding, that helped us understand better the prairie species that grew native in this area. And then we looked, Dwight looked at hay meadows, as Andy had indicated. He visited other prairie restorations to see what was growing, and then we also looked at plant lists for this area and range maps. From all of that research, we have a planting list. This is the 1984 list for the first planting of the Kauffman Museum Prairie Reconstruction. It consisted of, let me check my notes here, 17 species of grasses and sedges and 115 species of forbs that represented 16 plant families. As you can see here, each species was assigned a number, and that was used to document where it would be planted during the planting. And then each species also included information about the flowering season, the color, and where the seed would be sourced. Really important. I can also add that we planted for the next 11 years. I'll talk about that more in a little bit. But each planting had its own planting list, somewhat similar to this. Often it was similar, but there were adjustments made along the way. Okay. We now know what we're going to plant. Now we have to figure out where to get the seed. Sourcing native prairie seeds. Back in the 80s when we were working on this was not necessarily an easy task. You can order native prairie seeds now. They're fairly abundant. They're available anyway. But back then, not so much. And so Dwight spent a lot of months, and volunteers spent a lot of months collecting seed. And they were put in envelopes and listed where and when, and all the pertinent information was given there, and they were stored in shoe boxes. And so I got shoe boxes of seeds with shoe boxes of loaded with envelopes that were loaded with prairie seeds from all over. We collected seed from about a 50-mile radius so that we would have local ecotypes. Okay. I did that once a long time ago. Actually, I did that for the Dick Arboretum. Brad, some of you will recognize that. That's one of the signs out there. Anyway. So we bought seed from Sharp Brothers, Healy, Kansas. They have local ecotypes for grass seeds. So the grasses were planted from seed, and then transplants were sometimes used as well when we couldn't obtain seeds, and we had them readily available from native gardens or native pastures nearby. And then we had the seeds, and now we have to grow them. And so this was me for about 6 or 7 years of my life in the Bethel College greenhouse in the old science hall, figuring out how to get these guys to grow. A lot of the prairie seeds require cold, moist treatment, otherwise known as stratification. Some of them require scarification. That means that you sand them up a little bit. And for the cold, moist treatment, some of them needed to stay in cold for 2 months, sometimes 3 months, sometimes 30 days. But we didn't always know how long. And so it was my job to figure some of that stuff out, which was really intriguing and fascinating, and I could go on about that. But nonetheless, it involved putting seeds in pots and storing them in refrigerators for periods of time. Sometimes I put them in plastic bags and stored them in refrigerator for periods of time. And then they had to be potted out or flatted out, which is what you see at the bottom. In the bottom left, those are the seedlings of gayfeather, Liatris punctata, in case you were interested. And, of course, there was the care that was needed to go forth. And then I kept records of all of that, too, so I could see which treatments worked, the time and cold that needed to be had for a seed to germinate, and the list goes on. I just kept documenting that so that we would know more the next time we grew from seed. Planting the prairie. This is Dwight setting a row up, and I want to tell you how this went. Are you ready? Are you ready? Okay. There were 12 sets of 5 rows each with 12 inches between rows and 12 inches between planting points in each row. Each 5-set row was separated by 24 inches, and we planted 40% forbs and 60% grasses along each row. And then we documented each planting, what species went at each planting point, and we used the assigned number, which is in the grid over there, okay? And that's how we did it. That grid is, I am so familiar with that because when I wasn't here for the first planting, but when I came on board, I was helping Dwight inventory the plantings. And that was on a clipboard, and I was learning to identify the plants that were surviving along each row by what the number was and what we should be seeing. That was how I learned it. So that grid is, quite near and dear to my heart. But when I started working with Dwight on the Prairie reconstruction, actually, it was a defining time in my life. He had needed a student assistant to help inventory the planted prairie plots to determine which plants had survived. With this sheet on the clipboard, we moved row by row, planting point by planting point to see what was growing, what was appearing, and what wasn't. I can tell you that I loved the time outdoors. I loved learning to ID the just emerging plants. I learned them all by genus and species. And I loved working with Dwight, picking up bits and pieces of his extensive knowledge of the prairie, both in terms of plants and animals. I learned so much. I shall also say that I had no clue what the common names were for any of these species. So one day, this gentleman comes walking up the sidewalk and he asked me, "Oh, is there any big blue stem growing here?" And I said, I just referred him to Dwight because I didn't know. And Dwight nodded, "Yeah, we have that." And then I said, "Which one is it?" "Well, Andropogon's gerardii." "But of course." And eventually I learned common names to go along with the Latin monikers, but I learned it Latin first and then the common English name. That was fun. And then the reconstruction was completed. Subsequent plantings expanded the prairie to its current size. Changes in protocol occurred based on our growing experience and understanding of what worked and what didn't. We adjusted to obtain more efficient weed control. We adjusted to increase survival rates, and we adjusted to increase grass coverage in the mosaic of plantings. We mulched more. We planted into buffalo grass turf. We reduced tilling and increased the space between planting points. We added some prairie species, and we took some of the others out. Eventually, the planting, as is indicated here, was completed in 1995. We estimate now that there are approximately 190 species growing in the prairie, although that has not been inventoried or sampled for a number of years, and it probably should be done so again. But that gives you an idea of about what is out there. Well, now we have the care part, the management part. A prairie reconstruction does not grow or maintain itself. It has and continues to require human management. Early on, newly planted plots required regular editing, aka weeding, so that seedlings could establish. Additional editing of invasives has continued over the years. Annual mowing of some sections continues to remove accumulated vegetation, and mowing replicates grazing and the removal of vegetation through grazing. Since we can't rent a buffalo, we mow. It took several years to successfully coordinate efforts with the local fire department to permit burns within Newton city limits, but that came, and so burning is now an important part of the routine management protocol, with alternating sections of the prairie burned each year. Burning helps eliminate weedy annuals and controls invasive trees and shrubs. It also removes some of the vegetative growth above ground, and it helps return nutrients into the soil. It's a really important part of prairie management long term. And here we have, I think, Brad, that's probably you. Yes? Yeah, okay. The fire guy there by the sign. There have been challenges with management. Areas of the prairie where plants did not establish or where they established with difficulty occurred. Some of this can be attributed to soils. That was one part of the prairie that we could not reconstruct. We could not bring back the balance of nutrients that are available or are occurring, the balance and cycling of nutrients that are occurring in native prairie and mature prairies. And we didn't have the soil micro and macroorganisms that also support a flourishing prairie. Over time, those areas are starting to show improvement. But look, it's 40 years in, and it's, the disturbance of 100 years is still there, and it's taking a long time to reestablish. We're learning, and we're learning more about how to help things along, to put in inoculants and to otherwise treat soils so that there's a chance of better establishment. But it still takes time. And we also recognize what these challenges also suggest to us that this prairie is a fragment. It's surrounded by urban landscapes. It will never contain the biodiversity of species that a large mature prairie would have. In this setting, it's more challenging to maintain resilience when their disturbances occur, and it's more challenging to increase diversity or even maintain diversity sometimes. And it's challenging to discourage the arrival of invasive species, whether they are usually exotic weeds and trees and shrubs and that sort of thing. So a small fragment in the middle of an urban area will always require more management. That having been said, it's coming along. 40 years later, it's coming along. There's a lot that has happened, and it continues to happen, and improvements continue to be made. The prairie reconstruction remains then. So now the question is, all right, we have our prairie reconstruction, we're caring for it. How do you use it? Well, it's dynamic, it's interesting, ever-changing day to day, week to week, month to month, and year to year. That makes it a perfect classroom, a perfect laboratory to study, learn, grow, and continue to restore. So education is really, really important here. Native Oath, one of our earlier teaching docents, prairie docents, is shown in the upper left there. That's a much younger me with some school kids down below, and that's Dwight with a group of adults on probably a tour, a wildflower tour, a guided tour of some sort. Literally thousands of school children have visited over the years. Led by trained teaching docents, they experience the prairie personally with opportunities to explore the plants and critters that live there. Adults too come for wildflower walks and guided tours. Summertime Uncle Carl's camps include camps that investigate intriguing aspects of the prairie. You know, it is so interesting with school children. This has been my experience here. Often urban school kids, they have never been in a prairie before, and it's been interesting to see their response to this tall grass. Even though for us it's just tall grass out there, surrounded by mowed lawn. And these kids are like, what are the scary things in there? And by the end, they usually understand that this is really a safe place. It's an interesting place. It's a place to learn in and to investigate, to be comfortable in. And if we can even do that for our school kids, that's a big step forward in terms of appreciating the prairie. College students, particularly the ones I am familiar with, are Bethel and Hesston, have utilized the exhibit for biological field exercises also. They've examined a range of topics that include prairie plants, pollinators, small mammal populations, yes, we have mice there, microhabitats, and soils, just to name a few. And then several of our work study students here at Kauffman Museum have gone on to pursue degrees in conservation biology or in some area of conservation biology, due in part to working on the prairie restoration here. And then there's been research. I wanted to just point out some of the main pieces that have come out of this. The 10th North American Prairie Conference, Dwight presented Development and Survival of Plants in a Prairie Reconstruction of Kauffman Museum in South Central Kansas. And that was those grids, remember those grids? That was the basis for this research project, this analysis, this study. Finding out what survived for 1 year and then for the second year, and analyzing it gave us a sense of how successful the plantings were and how well it was working in terms of reconstruction. I wanted to just point out, is anybody curious about survival rates for 2 years? Okay. Depending on species and depending a little bit on some of the variables, it was 80 to 90%. And then 2 years later, no, I'm sorry, not 2 years later, 12 years later, Dwight and I co-presented a follow-up on this. Dwight reported particularly on the challenges faced in the two plantings, especially the bully prairie species that we shouldn't have planted and did, and the invasive species that we had battled, and then soil nutrient imbalances that had really caused some problems in terms of prairie establishment. And then I reported on the expansion of the educational and interpretive programming that was associated with the prairie reconstruction. And then there is growing native wildflowers. So when I started working on growing prairie plants from seed, I had so little information to go on. The interest in the topic was growing, and it was just starting to come forward, but there wasn't easily available. So I ended up scrubbing proceedings of the North American Prairie Conferences starting back in the 1960s, where I found some stuff, and there were a few botanical journals that had some stuff. So I was able to start locating bits and pieces of information, and it gave me a start towards the germinating the wildflowers and even knowing how to approach it and what protocols to use and that sort of thing. Well, Dwight and I are both members of the Kansas Native Plant Society. We were talking about this, and they were very interested in this, and they encouraged us to write a handbook about growing native wildflowers from seed. And so beginning in 1990, we did that. We ended up with 90 species. Over the course of the next 5 years, we wrote accounts for 90 species that gave information about the plants, the characteristics, and the germination requirements that we had learned about through the experimentation that we had done in the greenhouse. The handbook remains available today through the Dick Arboretum. It is, I think, an online resource, but it's still available. And it is still used sometimes. We've also been recognized at the national level. Gardening with Prairie Plants is by Sally Wasowski. Back in 2002, two Texas authors, Sally and Andy Wasowski, arrived at Kauffman Museum. Sally was writing a book about prairie landscapes, and they were traveling throughout the central states, prairie states, to locate example urban prairie landscapes. The Kauffman Museum's was one of theirs. And the museum's prairie reconstruction then was later featured in the book as an example of an urban landscape. Really interesting people. I stayed in touch with them for a bit. I don't know what has happened to them since, but they did write several other books. Interesting thing about this book, it's a really great reference. One of my relatives just recently got her degree actually last year got her degree in sustainable landscape architecture from the University of Texas. And we were talking on the phone one day, and she said, "Oh, do you know about this book, Gardening with Prairie Plants by Sally Wasowski?" And I said, "Well, yeah, I do." It's still considered an excellent reference for landscape architects in the prairie states. I thought that was quite interesting. So it's still relevant to this day. How do you use a prairie? Well, education and research. And then there is this intrinsic value of a prairie reconstruction. This is how I think of it. It's immeasurable by economics or even by human uses, but of immeasurable value. Nonetheless, it functions, it does its work, it continues as a living entity that exists as if to delight itself. And these photos also come from the Dick Arboretum. So we think about the history of land and our place on it. 40 years ago, the planners of our museum, I think, were prescient in including an outdoor prairie exhibit Today, museums are playing an increasingly important role in the education and interpretation of related issues of biodiversity, restoration, and conservation. In so doing, the Prairie Reconstruction provides connections so that visitors better understand the complex relationships that have developed over millennia between humans and the prairie land community of plants and animals. And think about the indigenous people who came before, and much more recently, the Mennonites and other European settlers. Complex relationships between the land community and people. And then there are prairies present. The maturing Prairie Reconstruction, now 40 years old, surrounds Kauffman Museum. I always think it looks like the building is embraced by prairie. Year by year, it welcomes life in all of its forms to this space. It's a mere fragment, but it continues to function, restoring soils, holding water, providing habitat for myriads of small animals, from insects to small mammals and amphibians and reptiles to birds. And it also provides a growing number of visitors, be they school kids or college students or visitors from afar or local residents, the ability to experience an accessible tallgrass prairie in an urban environment. Chris Helzer is a prairie ecologist from Nebraska, and he writes a blog post. In 2013, he wrote a blog post about his prairie garden, and I loved what he said. It's so reminiscent, or it reminds me so much of our own prairie reconstruction. Contributions to the education and awareness of the public might be the strongest conservation value of prairie gardens and native urban landscaping projects. Prairies suffer mightily from a lack of public awareness. Prairie gardens and other landscaping projects that use native prairie plants can help bring prairies to the people. Making prairie plants recognizable to our neighbors through prairie gardens means that if they ever do get to a prairie, they'll have at least some sense of familiarity with it. In addition, looking at pretty flowers and watching the number of insects, especially big showy ones like butterflies on those flowers, can give people at least a small sense of the beauty and importance of prairies. Listen to this. Prairie gardens are a gateway to prairie conservation. Prairie's present. Prairie's future. What's in store? Scientists call the American prairie one of the most threatened ecosystems on the planet. Will it disappear forever? As I indicated earlier, when I came on board this project nearly 40 years ago, there was so little written information available to a general public about prairies. That has changed dramatically over the past 40 years. We are looking at prairie in some place. We are losing prairie in some places. It's true, but we're also gaining prairie in some places. I want to read several excerpts from More Than Just Grass. U.S. Prairies Make a Comeback from the Christian Science Monitor. This is from about 5 years ago now. A vibrant sea of grasses once flowed across the North American continent, the great prairies that Laura Ingalls Wilder described as spreading to the edge of the sky. All but a fraction vanished during the 19th century as migrants from Europe advanced across the heart of America, plowing the land into farms and settlements. But not many people paid attention then. It's estimated that Illinois, which calls itself the Prairie State, has 1/10,000th of its prairies left. If we think about 25% of the North American continent as prairie, perhaps 5% remains intact. That's 90% that is gone. And the prairie is considered to be an extinct ecosystem because there are really no places that have all of the original components of that historic, 25% swath of land that was prairie once upon a time. That having been said, today's prairie conservationists agree that grasslands are underappreciated ecosystems. Most people think most people, I think, would drive past a prairie and just see a lot of boring grass, says Chris Helzer. Prairies are not an ecosystem that smack you in the face with beauty if you're not tuned into it. But in the 1980s, a prairie conservation movement that has been gradually growing since at least the 1950s started gaining serious momentum. Over the past 3 decades, a dedicated community of conservationists and land managers has worked to preserve American grasslands in all their manifold forms, the tallgrass, the shortgrass, and the mixed grass prairies of the Midwest, as well as lesser-known varieties along coasts. Since the 80s, conservationists have made significant progress in their ability to reestablish and care for prairie ecosystems. The exact acreage of prairie conservation efforts is somewhat difficult to track. A rough estimate, perhaps around 207,000 square miles of tall, mixed, and shortgrass biomes. But there are countless small preserves scattered across the United States, which can include areas as small as half an acre. Think Kauffman Museum, tallgrass prairie reconstruction. Temperate grasslands are one of the most least protected terrestrial biomes. They are traditionally the places that we have settled and plowed. The estimates are that less than 5% of prairies are in any form of long-term preservation and protection. Nonetheless, many conservationists are optimistic about the future. I think the most hopeful thing is that we have come a long way in our ability to restore prairie. As climate continues to change and agricultural practices continue to change, there will be opportunities where it makes sense for society to put some of the land in farms back into prairie habitat. And when that happens, we're ready to do it because we know how to do it. We have the ability to do it now. Prairies are good for the environment. Prairies have high amounts of biological diversity, and that diversity helps sustain life on Earth. Prairies are also huge carbon sinks. Restoring prairies ties up a lot of carbon so that it's not in the atmosphere. Chris Helzer again. Every time you go out onto a prairie, you see different things. There's different flowers that are blooming. There are different insects that are active. If you can get people to go to any prairie, even a half-acre prairie across town, think Kauffman Museum, you can always see something new and different. I like to think that the Kauffman Museum tallgrass prairie reconstruction has been at the vanguard of a lot of, and that it has and will continue to contribute to the restoration movement. That in turn was made possible in no small part by the planners of this prairie reconstruction and Dwight Platt. It is truly a lasting legacy for our community and beyond. I think about 40 years ago where we were, and I think about now. And it's a quantum leap in terms of what we can do, what people are doing. So I'll leave you with a few of these quotes. There is no etymological connection between prairie and prayer, but at times it seems there ought to be. But the prairie, as long as there is one stem of grass, it will come back. And then the last one, prairie restoration and reconstruction is incredibly important and gratifying. Let's celebrate our successes and keep looking for more ways to make bigger and better prairie landscapes. And I will leave you with a few of the additional reading. These are some of the references that I had. And then the last one, America's Lost Landscape, is available online. It's a really beautiful take on the prairie landscape, what happened to it, its history, and its past, present, and future of the history. And it's really beautifully done, so I would recommend that to you. And with that, I will close and I will entertain questions. Feel free. I didn't give you lots of details in some ways, so feel free to ask. Yes, ma'am.
you mean, I know Dwight was the major force behind the Prairie reconstruction. Who were the people who were planning Kauffman Museum who said we need to have this?
So the planners, John and Reinhild Jansen were part of that, and I don't know who all was on the team, in all honesty. Anybody can help on that?
They're asking who was on the team that came up with the idea.
Of having a Prairie reconstruction.
John,
Well,
Reinhold.
John and Reinhild, I don't know how far back it goes to people like Ozzy. I know Harold Neufeld was instrumental.
Okay, Harold
in the-
Neufeld was the landscape architect for this project. I remember that. And Steve Friesen, perhaps. I was thinking Ozzie Gehring, perhaps. And you know, I looked on that cover in that outline, and I didn't see people's names on there either, so. But I bet, honestly, I bet that before this year is out, we'll know who those planners were.
You alluded a couple times to certain species being removed. And I think these were ones you had planted rather than invasive ones. Can you say anything about why those were removed?
Sure. I'm ready for that one. I know them well. Okay, there is compass plant. There is a family called Silphium. And there's a lot of compass plant, and the Silphiums also include rosinweed, prairie dock. We only have one plant here, and we try to keep it clipped so it doesn't seed out. But the Silphiums have really big seeds, and they germinate easily in areas where they don't have a lot of competition. And once they get started, if you want to dig one out, bring a backhoe. They have huge root systems that go way, 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 way down. They're lovely in prairies. I have planted some in my pasture, but I have a really thick turf, and so they're just here and there. But this ground was totally open, and they had no competition, and so it's been really hard to get rid of them. There's another one that was a real bully, and that was Maximilian sunflower. Maximilian sunflower is another really aggressive species. If it gets good competition, it will maintain its place, so to speak. But it has one characteristic. It spreads by underground rhizomes. So if you have one plant, you can get many more. And the other thing about that is that it tends to be a little bit allelopathic. So if you have Maximilian sunflower, it's going to prevent germination of seeds around it. It prevents the growth of other plants around it. So it's kind of got a way of taking over a place again if it doesn't have a lot of competition. Those were the main ones that we encountered in this planting. I would tell we know that from the Dick Arboretum and Prairie Gardens there, or EPS gardens, you don't ever put in Silphiums, and you don't ever put in some of the sunflowers. You just don't. You wait until they're established, then you can start thinking about it.
So are those, the bully plants, how are they in a native prairie that's grazed? Is there a difference? Are those desirable grazing plants? Are they controlled that way?
Yeah, they are. They are. Okay, the question is, are they desirable grazing plants? Yeah, they are. Maximilian sunflower, maybe not so much, but the Silphiums, especially when they're young, are grazed. And it's not a problem. And like I say, I've just experienced in my own pastures where we have established prairie, where the grasses are pretty thick. I get one plant, but the seed drop, even if there is, the seeds have a hard time getting established when there aren't a lot of resources available immediately where that seed drops. That's the big difference.
Do you have listings of the plants that are out here in the prairie, and also of the diversity of some of the wildlife. Are they available to
Yeah, okay, I mean, I don't know if they're, Andy has some things here, okay. Our brochure, go ahead.
So we do carry a brochure that has lists. It's not comprehensive, but it does list some of the plants that are out in the prairie. So
It's the prominent ones. I mean, if we look at more the inventorying and the science and the sampling, yes, we do, but not really. I mean, they're stuck in files. I'll put it that way. But could be made available. Yes, yes.
Did you try to retrieve seeds from the 1880s collection?
We haven't. You know, I was looking at those plants, looking at those specimens the other day, and I thought, wow, these look really good yet. So, okay, Jean. See if they're, I don't know. I mean, if the seed is still viable. And it would depend, on the size of the seeds. The smaller seeds, of course, are going to be less viable, and they have not been refrigerated. And I don't know how they were cared for, early on. They're now stored they have climate control. But earlier on, I don't know, it's an interesting question.
I have two unrelated questions. One of them is, what is the impact of climate change on not the prairie in general, but also our restoration? And the other question is, were you the first in this area, or was there another urban garden that you were inspired by?
Okay. I'll answer your first question, climate change. I was looking at maps when I was preparing for this. I was looking at maps in terms of range. One of the things about prairie plants, if you think about grasses, for example, and a lot of the species, their range is pretty broad. If you remember the map of the range of purple prairie clover, for example, it goes from Canada all the way to Oklahoma, I think even into Texas, and pretty broad east to west as well. So the prairie actually may be more resilient to climate change, to changes in seasonal lengths and that sort of thing, simply because of that broad distribution. If we have the genetic material still available in the plants that exist, if we have the genetic variation in the plants that still exist. But that's hopeful for prairie, because it does have many of those plants have broad ranges across North America, north to south, and east to west. So in terms of our own, this may be more susceptible to climate change because it is, first of all, isolated from genetic material coming in, mixing with other genetic mixing by species. And so it's self-contained and it has a certain genetic mix, and there's not going to be a lot of new material coming in. And so theoretically anyway, I would say it's more susceptible to climate change than would be a broader expanse of prairie. Does that make sense? Okay. And then your other question, tell me again, sorry.
other stands of prairie.
Oh, yeah. Other prairie gardens. I didn't know anything about prairie. I'd spent 10 years in the Caribbean. I came back and, I had not been in Kansas for a long time, for any length of time since I was a really small child. So, backstory, I didn't know much. No, I didn't know anything about prairie. I'll just say that. When I started studying at Bethel College, I didn't know anything about prairie except the word, and yeah, it's grassland. But when I started working on the prairie reconstruction in the mid-'80s, I don't recall other prairie gardens in this area. I don't recall. I don't know if Dwight has any memory of that or not. I know that he looked at other reconstructions and restorations, but in a broader area than just this area. I know that we were one of the first because we got pushback. There were people who said, "Why didn't you put those weeds in your backyard?" You know, there was pushback, and, you know, signage was important initially because people didn't know what they were looking at. That changed. That has changed. But Prairie was a real unknown 40 years ago for the general public, I would say.
Partly related to your first answer to resiliency, and you painted a positive picture. I'm just back from having driven to Michigan and back across Kansas, Missouri, and Illinois, and am struck by the number of trees everywhere in Prairie, which kind of also relates to the climate change question, because more CO2 makes trees grow faster. So maybe comment on trees.
Yeah, trees are hugely critical. I mean, the removal of trees is hugely critical to the health and well-being of prairies. We call it the Green Glacier here in Kansas. It's moving in and it's taking over prairie pastures that were once grazed. They were, animals were pastured there, and people were living on the land and paying attention to the pastures that they needed for their farm animals. We're maintaining open grasslands. If you think about I think about driving to Kansas City and across Missouri now, and I think about the changes in the past 20 or 30 years and how the pastures have closed up. And trees will essentially destroy prairies. Bob and I have been cutting out cedars, and we've cut out, to our count, about 121 cedars over the last 3 years in our pasture, from small to large. And we know that when we remove those cedars, it takes a number of years for the grasses to move back in underneath. Cedars in particular take huge amounts of water out of the system, and they acidify the soil underneath, and they prevent prairie grasses from growing for a period of time. So management of open grasslands is still really, really critical to restoration. And so, again, if private landowners are aware of it, they can do something about it. In Kansas, I'll go back to what we know, 5%, am I right? 5% of prairies, 95% of the prairies in Kansas are in private hands, not public hands. And so if private landowners aren't involved, it's not going to happen. That's really critical. So private landowners are going to be, at least in our state, are going to be critical to the preservation of prairie going forward. I think there's more knowledge out there. I think people are aware of it, but it takes resources, it takes time, and it takes attention to the landscape. I don't know if I answered your question, but yeah, it's a huge issue.
We'll take one more, and then we'll transition.
Lorna, I was wondering about your own personal prairie that you have tried at your home. How big is it, and what kind of problems have you had with it besides the cedars?
So, do you want to come up and help me with this one, Bob? Okay. So, we have about 40 acres of prairie. When we purchased the land, it was overgrown, it was overgrazed, and it was also overgrown with trees. And it's been 40 years of our lives removing trees. We have a stream beside. The most amazing thing, people are going to get tired of hearing us talk about this, but when we remove the trees, the prairie grasses come back. They do. It takes time, but they do come back. And that, to me, is just life-giving, to know that It goes back to that one quote I said, as long as there is one living blade of grass, the prairie will return. I think that is what we do during the wintertime. We cut trees, and we've opened it up, and we spend hours and hours out there cutting trees and getting it opened up. But the grasses are there again. We have not had to do a lot. We lost a lot of the forbs, the wildflowers, from the grazing, because those are some of the first to go if prairie pastures are overgrazed. But even some of those are coming back, and I've been seed bombing and working on that, and we're getting stuff back in. It's happening, and it's experimentation. It is like, how do you get stuff going again? And you just keep trying and trying, and if you don't try, you won't know. So, yeah.
Well, thank you, Lorna, and I
Yeah,
think
you're
you'll
welcome.
stay around to answer more questions. Is that right?
Mm-hmm.
Yeah, so I think ending on the note that prairie is life-giving is appropriate. So we'll stop with that. Thank you so much, Lorna.
Yeah, you're welcome. Thank you.